The strange thing about disrespect is that people rarely expect consequences. That thought was the first clear sentence that crossed my mind while I stood in my father-in-law's backyard last Saturday afternoon, surrounded by folding chairs, half-empty soda cans, and the smell of burgers drifting off a cheap propane grill. My name is Daniel Carter, 37 years old, 5'11", born and raised in Ohio, and for most of my adult life I believed that staying calm is the strongest move a man can make. But calmness has a strange side effect. People start to mistake it for weakness. My wife Emily's family had always treated me like background noise at their gatherings. I was the quiet husband, the guy who refilled the cooler and stacked paper plates when the party ended. No one asked what I did for a living. No one really cared. Especially Ryan Mitchell, my brother-in-law. Ryan was the kind of guy who filled every room with his voice before he even stepped through the door. Loud laugh, louder opinions, the kind of confidence that grows when someone spends their whole life being told they're the center of the universe. That afternoon he'd already been drinking since noon, pacing around the backyard telling stories that got bigger every time he repeated them. At some point the conversation turned toward money. It always did with Ryan. He liked to measure people by what they drove, what they wore, and how quickly they could pull out a wallet. When he started talking about me, the jokes came easy. A few cousins chuckled. Someone muttered something about me being quiet but harmless. Emily stood near the patio table pretending to scroll through her phone. I remember thinking how strange it was that humiliation can feel colder than anger. Like someone turned the temperature down 20 degrees without warning. Ryan stepped closer, his voice sharp with that careless confidence people have when they believe there are no consequences waiting around the corner. The moment lasted only seconds, but the laughter that followed carried across the entire yard. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply stood there, brushed the dust off my shirt, and looked Ryan straight in the eyes. Calm is a powerful thing when everyone expects chaos. The noise around us slowly faded because people sensed something had shifted. Okay, I said quietly. Just one word. Ryan smirked like he'd won something important. Emily finally glanced up, sighing the way someone does when they think a situation is too trivial to care about. Just ignore him, she said under her breath as she walked past me. Ignore him. Funny how simple advice can sound when you're not the one standing in the middle of the room. The party continued like nothing had happened. Someone turned up the music. Kids ran through the grass with water balloons. Ryan went back to telling stories about himself. But inside my head something had already moved into place, quiet and precise, like the first piece of a puzzle sliding exactly where it belongs. Because when a man shows you exactly who he is in front of a crowd, you don't argue with him. You simply remember the moment. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, you return the lesson the very next day. The rest of that afternoon passed the way most family gatherings do, with too much noise and too many small conversations pretending nothing unusual had happened. Ryan drifted back toward the grill, laughing loudly as if the moment earlier had already faded from his memory. To him it probably had. People like Ryan moved quickly from one performance to the next. I stood near the cooler for a while, pouring myself a glass of iced tea and listening to the rhythm of the party settle back into place. Laughter rose and fell across the yard. Someone turned on a portable speaker and old country music floated through the warm air. From the outside it probably looked like I had simply brushed everything off. That was the story everyone wanted to believe. Emily walked over after a few minutes and leaned against the patio railing beside me. She did not look concerned. She looked tired, the way someone does when they think a situation is unnecessarily dramatic. She folded her arms and said quietly, "Daniel, you know how Ryan is. It is better to let things go." I nodded slowly, watching the ice cubes shift in my glass. The truth was I did know how Ryan was. I had been watching him for years. Loud opinions, short temper, constant need to prove himself in front of an audience. The kind of man who believed that confidence and volume were the same thing. Emily mistook my silence for agreement. She gave a small relieved smile and walked back toward her cousins. The afternoon sunlight stretched long across the backyard, turning the grass gold and casting shadows under the folding chairs. Ryan's voice kept cutting through the air every few minutes, louder than the music, louder than anyone else. I listened without reacting, but my mind had already moved somewhere else entirely. There is a moment when embarrassment turns into clarity. It does not feel explosive. It feels quiet, almost peaceful, like the air after a storm when everything suddenly becomes sharp and easy to see. I stayed another hour, maybe two. I helped Robert carry a cooler into the garage. I stacked empty paper plates into a trash bag. I shook hands with relatives as they began drifting toward their cars. To everyone else I looked exactly the same as I always did, calm, polite, almost forgettable. That was the version of me they had decided was real. Around 6 in the evening Emily and I walked back to our car parked along the curb. The sky was turning orange behind the rows of houses and the neighborhood was settling into that quiet suburban rhythm where lawn sprinklers click on and the smell of barbecue smoke hangs in the air. Emily buckled her seatbelt and let out a long breath. "Today got a little out of hand," she said, staring through the windshield. "Ryan should not have done that, but you know he has been stressed lately." I started the engine and pulled away from the curb without answering right away. The road ahead stretched straight through the neighborhood, lined with identical mailboxes and tall maple trees. After a moment I finally spoke. It was just one calm sentence, delivered the same way I had spoken earlier in the backyard. "Do not worry about it." Emily nodded as if the problem had already solved itself. She leaned back against the seat and opened her phone again, scrolling through messages while the houses slid past the windows. But while she relaxed, thinking the situation had already faded into yesterday's noise, I was already thinking about tomorrow morning. Because patience is not about letting things go. Patience is about choosing the exact moment when something returns. I woke up the next morning before the sun came up, the way I usually do on weekdays, even though it was Sunday. Habit is a strange thing. Once your body learns a rhythm, it keeps following it long after the reason disappears. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels almost fragile, like the air is waiting for someone to break it. I walked into the kitchen, poured a cup of black coffee, and stood by the window while the sky slowly turned from deep blue to pale gray. Across the street a sprinkler ticked back and forth across a neighbor's lawn, sending arcs of water across the grass. Everything looked calm, predictable, ordinary. That was the funny part about moments that change your life. They rarely look dramatic from the outside. Emily was still asleep upstairs. Her phone had buzzed a few times during the night, messages from family group chats and cousins sharing pictures from the barbecue. From what I could see on the screen when it lit up earlier, Ryan had already turned yesterday into another story about himself. The loud brother, the life of the party. I finished my coffee slowly and sat down at the dining table with my laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dim kitchen light as it powered on. Most people assume revenge comes from anger, but anger is messy. It pushes people to react too quickly, to say the wrong thing, to lose control. I have always believed that the most effective response begins with patience and paperwork. I opened a folder on my computer and started organizing the details from yesterday. Time of the gathering. Location. Names of the people who were present. Small details matter more than people realize. Witnesses. Timeline. Context. The law does not care about emotions. It cares about facts. By the time the clock on the stove reads 7:30, the first draft of what I needed was already sitting neatly on my desktop. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. A few minutes later footsteps sounded softly on the stairs. Emily walked into the kitchen wearing one of my old college sweatshirts and rubbing her eyes. She glanced at me, then at the empty coffee mug beside the sink. "You woke up early again," she said. I shrugged lightly. Could not sleep. She opened the refrigerator and poured herself a glass of orange juice without looking in my direction. Ryan texted the family group. "This morning," she added casually. "Apparently he thinks yesterday was hilarious." I nodded slowly, not reacting. Emily noticed my calm expression and relaxed, taking that as confirmation that everything had passed. That was the version of events she preferred, a quick storm followed by clear skies. She sipped her juice and leaned against the counter. "I am glad you did not escalate anything," she said. "Ryan can be difficult, but he means well." I looked at the sunlight now spilling through the kitchen window and rested my hands on the table. Sometimes the hardest part of a lesson is timing. If you give it too early, no one understands it. If you give it too late, no one cares anymore. I simply nodded again and said nothing. Emily finished her drink and walked back upstairs to get dressed. The house returned to silence. I stood up, walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, and pulled a blank white envelope from the drawer. Clean. Simple. Ordinary. The kind of envelope people expect to hold something routine, something harmless. I placed the printed documents inside and sealed the flap carefully. Tomorrow morning Ryan would believe that envelope contained exactly what he expected. And sometimes expectation is the most powerful part of a story. Monday morning arrived with the kind of quiet routine that makes people believe the world is simple. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in the living room, drawing thin lines of gold across the hardwood floor while the coffee maker hummed softly on the kitchen counter. I woke up before my alarm, the same way I had for years, and stood for a moment looking out at the street. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the house. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once and then stopped. Nothing about the morning felt unusual. That was exactly the point. Emily had already left for work by the time I finished my second cup of coffee. She kissed my cheek quickly on her way out the door and reminded me that her parents might stop by later in the week. Her tone was light, relaxed, the way people sound when they believe the tension from the weekend has already disappeared. I nodded and wished her a good day. The front door closed behind her, and the house returned to that steady suburban silence that fills most weekday mornings. I walked into my small home office and sat down at the desk where the white envelope rested neatly beside my laptop. It looked completely ordinary, just a plain rectangle of paper against a dark wood surface. No one looking at it would have guessed it represented anything more than a simple note, or maybe a check. I picked it up and turned it over once in my hands, feeling the weight of the pages inside. Patience is not dramatic. It is quiet preparation, while everyone else believes the story has already ended. Around 9:30 my phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up with Ryan's name. I let it ring for a moment before answering. His voice came through the speaker full of the same careless confidence I had heard all weekend. "Daniel," he said, laughing lightly, "about yesterday. I might have gone a little far, but you know how these family things are." His tone carried the strange mixture of apology and arrogance that some people use when they assume forgiveness is guaranteed. I listened without interrupting. Then he continued speaking, lowering his voice slightly as if sharing a secret. "Look, Emily told me you wanted to smooth things over. She said you might have something for me. Maybe we can put the whole thing behind us." I leaned back in my chair and glanced at the envelope resting beside my hand. The plan had already taken shape long before this phone call arrived. People often reveal their expectations before you ever have to ask. "Yes," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady. "I have something for you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the smile forming in Ryan's mind as he imagined exactly what that envelope contained. Money was the language he understood best. "When should I come by?" he asked quickly. I checked the clock on the wall even though I had already decided. 10:30 works for me, I said. "My house." Another small pause followed, then a short laugh. "Perfect," Ryan replied. "See you soon." The call ended with the soft click of the speaker going silent again. I placed the phone back on the desk and looked around the quiet room. Outside, a light breeze moved the branches of the maple tree near the driveway. Everything felt calm, predictable, almost peaceful. I slid the envelope toward the center of the desk and waited. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in a story is not the action itself. It is the quiet hour before someone finally opens the truth they never expected to see. The quiet before 10:30 felt longer than it should have. I sat in the living room with the envelope resting on the coffee table, the morning sunlight slowly shifting across the carpet as the minutes moved forward. Outside, the neighborhood carried on with its usual rhythm. A mail truck rolled past the house. Somewhere down the street a garage door opened and closed. The ordinary sounds of a Monday morning continued like nothing unusual was about to happen. I had learned something important about people like Ryan over the years. They believe confidence protects them from consequences. They believe charm, laughter, and loud voices can smooth over any situation. And most of the time, they are right, because everyone around them chooses the easier path of silence. But silence is not the same thing as surrender. At exactly 10:28 I heard the low rumble of a truck turning onto our street. I did not need to look out the window to know it was him. A few seconds later the engine stopped in front of the house and a car door slammed shut. Footsteps crossed the driveway with the casual pace of someone who expected to leave a little richer than he arrived. The doorbell rang once, short and confident. I stood up, straightened my shirt, and walked to the front door. When I opened it, Ryan stood on the porch wearing sunglasses and the same relaxed smile he carried at every family gathering. He held a cup of gas station coffee in one hand and leaned casually against the railing like he was stopping by for a friendly visit. "Morning, Daniel," he said. His tone was lighter than it had been on the phone earlier, almost playful. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, glancing around the living room with quick curiosity before his eyes settled on the envelope resting on the coffee table. I could almost see the calculation happening behind his sunglasses. White envelope. Thick enough to hold several pages. Probably a check, maybe even cash. That was the story he had already decided on before he arrived. We sat down across from each other in the living room. Ryan set his coffee on the table and nodded toward the envelope. "So that must be it," he said with a grin. I kept my voice calm. "It is exactly what we talked about." His smile widened slightly, the kind of expression people wear when they believe they have already won. He reached forward and picked up the envelope, turning it once in his hands before sliding a finger under the sealed flap. The room stayed quiet except for the soft sound of paper opening. Ryan pulled the documents out and unfolded the first page. For a few seconds his expression did not change. His eyes moved slowly across the printed lines, then back to the top of the page again. The confidence that had filled the room just moments earlier began to fade, replaced by a strange stillness that spread across his face. He lowered the paper slightly and looked at me, confusion replacing the smile he had arrived with. "Daniel," he said slowly, "this is not money?" I nodded once, keeping my voice steady and even. "No, it is not." Ryan looked back down at the documents again, reading the heading more carefully this time. The silence in the room stretched long enough for the meaning of those words to settle in. Sometimes people expect a simple apology. Sometimes they expect a check. But every now and then the only thing waiting inside an envelope is the beginning of a very different kind of conversation. Ryan read the first page again, slower this time, like his eyes were hoping the words might change if he gave them another chance. The room felt different now. The confidence he carried through the front door had drained away, replaced by the heavy silence that appears when someone realizes a situation is no longer under their control. He lowered the document and looked at me carefully, trying to understand something that no longer fit the story he had built in his head. "Daniel," he said quietly, "this has to be some kind of joke." I shook my head once. "It is not a joke." Ryan glanced back down at the paper again. His sunglasses were now resting on the coffee table beside his cup, and for the first time I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The page he was holding was simple and clear. A formal report documenting the incident from the weekend. Names, location, time, and a list of witnesses who had been present in the backyard when everything happened. Behind that first page were additional documents. A statement prepared with the help of an attorney. Information about the next legal steps. The language was calm, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. Ryan flipped through the papers quickly now, each page making the situation a little more real. His voice came out slower when he finally spoke again. "You actually filed this," he said. I leaned back in my chair and kept my tone even. Yes, I did. The silence returned for a moment, while he processed that answer. Outside the living room window a car passed along the street, and a neighbor's wind chime rattled softly in the breeze. Ordinary sounds continued like nothing unusual was happening inside the house. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck and gave a short laugh that did not carry much confidence. Come on, Daniel, he said. We are family. Things get heated sometimes. You really want to turn something small into a legal problem. I looked at the envelope still resting on the table between us. Small moments have a way of growing larger when they are ignored long enough. I chose my words carefully. Yesterday you believed there would be no consequences. Today you know that assumption was incorrect. Ryan leaned forward in his chair, the papers still in his hand. His voice lowered, the casual tone from earlier replaced by something more cautious. We can fix this, he said. I can apologize. We can call it a misunderstanding. Nobody has to take this any further. I studied his expression for a moment. The same man who had arrived expecting money was now negotiating with reality. People often believe respect can be restored with a quick apology once the balance of power shifts. Sometimes they are right. But respect has a memory. I folded my hands together and spoke slowly. The process has already started. What happens next will depend on how you handle it. Ryan looked down at the documents again, the weight of them finally settling in. The room stayed quiet for several seconds while the meaning of the pages spread through the space between us. When he finally looked up again, the confidence he had worn like armor all weekend was gone. In its place was the first honest expression I had ever seen from him. And that was the moment he understood that the envelope had never been about money at all. Ryan sat there for several seconds without speaking, the documents still spread across his hands like pieces of a puzzle he had never expected to see. The confident rhythm he carried into the house was gone now. In its place was a kind of quiet calculation, the moment when someone begins to understand that the rules of the situation have changed. He placed the pages slowly back on the coffee table and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment before letting out a long breath. You really went through with this, he said, more to himself than to me. I did not answer right away. Sometimes silence is the clearest response. Outside the living room window the breeze picked up slightly, moving the branches of the maple tree and sending a scatter of sunlight across the floor. The neighborhood continued its normal Monday routine, completely unaware that a small turning point had just taken place inside our house. Ryan rubbed his temples and then looked at me again, this time with a seriousness I had never seen from him before. Daniel, listen, he said slowly, this is going too far. We both know that whole thing on Saturday got blown out of proportion. People were drinking. Everyone was joking around. Nobody thought it was a big deal. I studied his expression carefully. That sentence was interesting, because it revealed exactly how he had always understood the situation. When people laughed, he believed the laughter erased everything. When the moment passed, he believed the consequences disappeared with it. I folded my hands together on the table and spoke in the same calm tone I had used all morning. The difference between us, Ryan, is that I believed it mattered. He looked down again at the pages. His fingers tapped lightly against the paper as if he was searching for a different explanation hidden somewhere between the lines. After a few seconds he spoke again, this time with a softer voice. Emily knows about this. I shook my head once. Not yet. Ryan leaned forward slightly, the worry finally showing in his face. She is not going to be happy about this, he said. Her parents will lose their minds if they hear you involved lawyers. I nodded slowly. That may be true. But their reaction does not change what already happened. The room grew quiet again. Ryan reached for his coffee, then stopped halfway and pulled his hand back as if he had suddenly forgotten why he picked it up in the first place. I could see the realization forming behind his eyes. For the first time in years, the noise and humor he usually relied on were not enough to shift the situation back in his favor. He looked around the room for a moment before speaking again. So what happens now? He asked carefully. The question hung in the air between us, heavier than anything that had been said so far. I glanced at the documents once more and then back at him. What happens next depends on what you decide to do after today. Ryan stared at me, trying to measure whether there was still some hidden shortcut out of the problem. But the truth about consequences is simple. They do not disappear just because someone wishes they would. And in that moment, sitting across from me in the quiet living room, Ryan finally understood that the story he thought ended at the barbecue had only just begun. Ryan remained silent for a long moment after asking what would happen next, his eyes still fixed on the papers resting on the coffee table. The confidence he carried into the house earlier that morning had completely faded now, replaced by a careful stillness that usually appears when someone realizes they have stepped into unfamiliar territory. He leaned forward again and gathered the documents into a neat stack, as if organizing them might somehow make the situation easier to understand. The sunlight coming through the window had shifted across the room, touching the edge of the envelope and casting a thin line of brightness across the table between us. Ryan cleared his throat quietly before speaking again. "Daniel, there has to be another way to handle this," he said. His voice was calmer now, but the edge of concern was impossible to hide. "We are family. Things like this should stay inside the family." I listened without interrupting. It was the same argument people always used when consequences finally appeared. Keep it quiet. Smooth it over. Pretend it never happened. Ryan continued speaking, leaning back slightly in his chair as if trying to regain some of the composure he had lost earlier. "If this goes forward, it will cause problems for everyone," he said. "My parents will hear about it. Emily will hear about it. Thanksgiving dinner will never be the same again." I looked at the stack of papers resting on the table. Sometimes the hardest truth for people to accept is that the damage happened long before the paperwork appeared. I spoke slowly, keeping my tone steady. "The problem already happened, Ryan. The documents only describe it." He sighed and rubbed his hands together, thinking carefully now instead of reacting the way he normally would. Outside the house a passing car slowed briefly before continuing down the street, its tires humming softly against the pavement. Ryan glanced toward the window, and then back at me. "What if I apologize properly?" he asked. "Not just to you, but to everyone who was there. We can clear it up and move on." I considered the suggestion for a moment. Apologies can be powerful when they are sincere, but they often arrive too late, after the balance of power has already shifted. The truth is that people rarely apologize until they feel pressure. Ryan watched my expression carefully, trying to read whether there was still room for negotiation. I finally spoke again. "An apology is always a good place to start. But it does not erase what already happened." The room grew quiet once more. Ryan stared down at the documents again, the reality of them slowly settling in. His fingers tapped lightly against the table as if counting invisible possibilities. Finally he stood up and picked up the envelope again, sliding the papers back inside with slow, deliberate movements. "I will need to talk to someone about this," he said carefully. "A lawyer maybe?" I nodded once. "That would be a wise decision." Ryan walked toward the front door, then paused with his hand on the handle. For a moment he looked back at me, searching for some sign that this situation might still disappear if he waited long enough. But the calm in the room made it clear that waiting would not change anything. When he finally opened the door and stepped outside, the quiet house returned to the same stillness it had before he arrived. The only difference now was that both of us understood something new. Some lessons begin with laughter. Others begin the moment someone opens an envelope they never expected. The front door closed behind Ryan with a soft click, and for a moment the house returned to complete silence. I remained standing in the living room where he had left, watching through the window as he walked slowly down the driveway toward his truck. His steps were not as confident as they had been when he arrived earlier that morning. The envelope was still in his hand now, the same plain white rectangle that had looked so ordinary an hour ago. It was interesting how quickly expectations can collapse when reality replaces imagination. Ryan paused beside his truck before opening the door, glancing back toward the house once as if he expected me to appear at the window and call him back inside. I did not move. After a few seconds he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The truck pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner, leaving the street quiet again. I walked back to the coffee table and sat down, letting the calm settle through the room. The clock on the wall read 10:47. Less than 20 minutes had passed since Ryan first rang the doorbell. Sometimes the most important shifts in a person's life happen in less time than it takes to finish a cup of coffee. I leaned back in the chair and listened to the quiet house. Outside, the wind chimes on my neighbor's porch clinked softly as a light breeze moved through the trees. Everything looked exactly the same as it had earlier that morning. The same street, the same houses, the same peaceful neighborhood rhythm. The difference now existed somewhere invisible, in the understanding that one line had been crossed and another had been drawn in its place. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, lighting up the screen with Emily's name. I already knew what the call meant before I answered. News travels quickly through families, especially when the story involves someone unexpected. I picked up the phone and held it to my ear. "Daniel, what is going on?" Emily asked immediately, her voice tense and confused. "Ryan just called me. He said you gave him some kind of legal paperwork." I looked toward the window where sunlight continued to stretch across the living room floor. "Yes," I said calmly. "I did." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Emily exhaled slowly, as if she was trying to sort through a dozen different thoughts at once. "Daniel, this is serious," she said. "My parents are going to hear about this. Ryan is already talking about calling a lawyer." I nodded slightly even though she could not see me. That would be a good step for him to take. Another silence followed, heavier this time. I could almost picture Emily standing in her office, staring out a window the same way I had earlier that morning, trying to understand how a moment from a weekend barbecue had turned into something much larger. Finally she spoke again, her voice quieter now. "I thought you were going to ignore it." I looked around the room once more before answering. "Ignoring something does not make it disappear, Emily. Sometimes it only teaches people that they can do it again." The line stayed quiet after that. And in that quiet space between us, the reality of the situation began settling into place for everyone involved. Emily did not hang up immediately after my last sentence. The silence between us stretched long enough that I could hear faint office noise on her end of the call, keyboards clicking somewhere in the background and the distant murmur of people talking down a hallway. Finally she spoke again, slower this time, as if she was choosing each word more carefully. "Daniel," she said, Ryan sounded shaken. I leaned back in the chair and watched the sunlight move across the floor. "That is not surprising," I replied calmly. Emily exhaled again. I could tell she was trying to reconcile two different versions of me at the same time. The quiet husband who avoided family arguments, and the man who had just handed her brother legal paperwork. They were both the same person, but until that morning she had only believed in one of them. "Daniel," she continued, "this is going to create a huge problem with my parents. My father is not going to stay calm about something like this." I nodded slightly even though she could not see it. "I understand that." Another pause followed, heavier now. Emily lowered her voice. "Are you planning to push this all the way through?" I took a moment before answering. People often expect quick emotional decisions in moments like this. But the truth is that decisions made calmly are much harder to undo later. "The process has already started," I said. "What happens next depends on how Ryan chooses to respond." Emily did not answer right away. I could almost picture her standing near her office window, looking out at the parking lot the way people do when they are trying to think clearly in the middle of something uncomfortable. Finally she spoke again, and this time her tone had changed. It was not angry. It was uncertain. "I did not realize you were this serious about what happened." I glanced toward the empty coffee mug still sitting on the table. "Seriousness does not always look loud," I said quietly. "Sometimes it just waits for the right moment." Emily remained quiet after that. I knew she was replaying the weekend in her mind now, remembering the laughter, the casual comments, the way everyone had assumed the moment would disappear once the music started again. The problem with assumptions is that they only work when everyone involved agrees with them. Daniel, she finally said, Ryan mentioned witnesses. He said the paperwork listed people who were at the barbecue. That is correct, I replied. Her voice tightened slightly. That means other family members might be contacted. Possibly, I said. The legal process tends to follow the facts wherever they lead. Another long silence followed. When Emily spoke again, her voice was softer than before, almost thoughtful. I think everyone believed you would just let it go. I looked around the quiet living room, the same peaceful space that had existed before any of this began. For a long time that was exactly what I did, I answered. I let things go. Emily did not respond immediately, but when she finally spoke, her words carried a new understanding that had not been there earlier. I guess people got used to that. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see the gesture through the phone. Yes, I said calmly. That is exactly what happened. Emily stayed quiet on the line for several seconds after her last words, and I could almost hear the realization settling in on her side of the call. When people become accustomed to someone always stepping back, they slowly stop considering the possibility that one day the pattern might change. The sound of a chair moving came through the phone as she shifted somewhere in her office. Daniel, she said carefully, Ryan is already calling our parents. I expected that, I replied calmly. News like this tends to travel quickly. She sighed softly. My father is not going to take this lightly. You know how protective he is of Ryan. I glanced toward the window where the quiet street stretched under the late morning sun. Yes, I said. I know exactly how he is. Another pause followed, this one heavier than the others. Emily lowered her voice again. He is probably going to call you soon. That is fine, I said. I will answer if he does. The line went quiet for a moment, and then Emily spoke again, but this time her tone was less defensive and more thoughtful. Daniel, she said slowly, can I ask you something honestly? Of course, I replied. Why did you decide to handle it this way now? For years you always ignored things like this. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the room. The living room still looked exactly the same as it had that morning, peaceful and ordinary. But the conversation we were having carried more weight than any argument we had ever had before. I chose my words carefully. Because ignoring something teaches people a lesson too. It teaches them that they can keep doing it. Emily did not interrupt. She simply listened. For a long time I believed staying quiet was the easier path, I continued. It avoided arguments. It kept family gatherings peaceful. But eventually people stop seeing silence as patience. They start seeing it as permission. The phone remained quiet on the other end while she processed that thought. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a hint of regret that had not been there earlier. I never thought of it that way. I nodded slightly even though she could not see the gesture. Most people do not. There was another long pause, and then Emily asked something that sounded more personal than the rest of the conversation. Are you angry with me too? I took a moment before answering. Not angry, I said honestly. But I did notice something on Saturday. What do you mean? She asked quietly. When everything happened in the backyard, I said. Slowly, you asked me to ignore it. You did not ask if I was okay. Emily did not respond right away. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else we had discussed. Finally she spoke, and this time her voice carried a level of sincerity I had not heard yet that morning. Daniel, I am sorry. I should have handled that moment differently. I listened to her words without interrupting. Apologies sometimes arrive too late to change the past, but they can still change what happens next. After a few seconds I spoke again, keeping my tone calm. What matters now is how everyone handles what comes next. And judging by the quiet that followed on the phone line, Emily was beginning to understand that the situation had moved far beyond a simple weekend argument. After Emily's apology, the line remained quiet for several seconds, and the silence between us felt different from before. Earlier it had been confusion. Now it carried a sense of recognition, as if something that had been ignored for years had finally been brought into the open. Emily spoke first. Daniel, she said slowly, I understand why you are doing this more than I did earlier. I did not respond immediately. Outside the window, a light breeze moved the branches of the maple tree again, casting shifting shadows across the living room floor. Understanding does not always arrive all at once. Sometimes it appears piece by piece, like sunlight slowly filling a room. A moment later, Emily continued. My father is probably already trying to reach you. Ryan told him everything. I nodded slightly even though she could not see it. That is expected, I replied. When situations change, people usually call the person they believe can restore the old balance. Emily let out a small breath. My father still believes this can be solved with a conversation. I looked toward the phone resting in my hand. Conversations are useful when everyone involved is ready to listen, I said calmly. The problem is that most people only listen once consequences appear. She did not argue with that. Instead, she asked something that sounded more reflective than defensive. Do you think Ryan actually understands what this means yet? I thought about the moment he stood in the living room reading the documents for the second time, watching the certainty disappear from his face as the situation settled into reality. Not completely, I answered. But he is beginning to. Emily remained quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice sounded steadier than before. Daniel, I am not asking you to change what you decided. I just want you to know that I see things differently now than I did on Saturday. That sentence carried more weight than she probably realized. Recognition is sometimes the first step toward real change. I leaned forward slightly and rested my elbows on the table. What matters now is what people do next, I said. Words help, but actions usually speak louder over time. Emily agreed quietly. A few seconds later my phone vibrated again with another incoming call. I glanced down at the screen and saw the name I expected to appear sooner or later. Robert Mitchell. Emily's father. I told her who was calling, and she inhaled slowly on the other end of the line. He must have just heard the whole story from Ryan, she said. Most likely, I replied. Are you going to answer? She asked carefully. I looked at the name on the screen for a moment, as it continued flashing across the phone. Avoiding the call would only delay a conversation that was already moving toward us. Yes, I said calmly. It is probably time. Emily did not try to stop me this time. Instead, she spoke quietly before we ended the call. Whatever happens next, Daniel, I hope everyone finally understands why you made this decision. I listened to her words for a moment before replying. That understanding was the only thing I hoped would come from all of this. Then the line between us went silent, and the next chapter of the conversation waited on the other call still ringing in my hand. The phone continued to vibrate in my hand with Robert Mitchell's name glowing across the screen. I watched it ring for a moment before answering, letting the calm in the room settle around me first. When I finally pressed the button and lifted the phone to my ear, Robert's voice came through immediately, firm and controlled in the way people speak when they are trying very hard not to sound angry. Daniel, he said, I just spoke with Ryan. I assume you know why I am calling. I leaned back slightly in the chair and looked toward the quiet street outside the window. Yes, I said calmly. I can imagine what he told you. Robert paused for a moment before continuing. Ryan says you handed him legal documents this morning? Is that accurate? Yes, it is, I replied. The line went silent for a second. I could almost hear him processing the situation the same way Emily had earlier. Daniel, he said slowly, families do not usually solve problems this way. I listened carefully to the tone of his voice. It was not shouting. It was the voice of someone who believed authority alone could still guide the outcome. I understand that perspective, I answered. But some problems do not disappear just because people prefer them to stay quiet. Robert exhaled slowly on the other end of the call. Ryan made a mistake, he admitted. But turning it into a legal matter is going to create a situation that affects everyone in this family. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. That may be true, I said. But the situation already existed. The paperwork only acknowledges it. Robert remained silent for several seconds. Then he spoke again, this time with a more measured tone. Daniel, if Ryan offers a genuine apology, would you consider resolving this privately? The question hung in the air for a moment. Outside, a breeze moved through the neighborhood again, rustling leaves and setting the wind chimes down the street gently tapping together. I thought about the weekend, about the laughter in the backyard, about the way everyone had assumed the moment would vanish the same way it always had before. Finally I answered. An apology would be a responsible first step. But responsibility also means accepting the consequences of your actions. Robert did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded different from when the call began. Less certain. More reflective. I suppose Ryan is learning that lesson right now. That is my hope, I replied calmly. The conversation ended a few minutes later without raised voices or dramatic conclusions. Robert simply said he would speak with Ryan again and consider the next steps carefully. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly in the living room. The same quiet house. The same sunlight across the floor. But something had shifted, not just in Ryan's understanding, but in the way the entire situation would be remembered from that point forward. Because respect is not restored through noise or arguments. It begins the moment people realize that silence does not always mean surrender, and that sometimes the quietest response carries the clearest message of all.